We do. It's so wonderful, and I've got my reading glasses on my head. I forget. How many of you walk around with your reading glasses on your head and forget about them? Because I think, yeah, this is something. Well, it's a delight to have all of you here this evening. I see some faces that I see regularly at programs and some new faces, and I know that we're competing tonight with the Preservation Alliance for a program, so that was not great planning on our part or their part. I don't know who will blame for that, but I'm so grateful for all of you that you chose the Athenaeum tonight for your learning and engagement. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum, and if you're new here, we are a cultural forum. We are an historical institution that celebrates Philadelphia, our history, our built environment, our literature, and the ways that we intersect with the rest of the world. And so if you enjoy what you experienced tonight, both in the learning opportunities and engagement with one another, I hope you will come back again for other programming, as well as think about becoming a member, because we always welcome more members to be a part of this wonderful, amazing community. I'm excited tonight to welcome from Buffalo, Charles L. Davis II, who's an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Buffalo. And he was telling me he actually hails from the Buffalo area, although he has taught all over the US. So we're grateful for him for coming down to the slightly warmer climes of Philadelphia for the day. Dr. Davis received his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and he has an M.Arch and B.P.S from the University of Buffalo. His academic research excavates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and in contemporary design culture. Important conversations for us to be having today. Charles is co-editor of Race and Modern Architecture, which collects 18 case studies on the racial discourses of modern architecture from the Enlightenment to the present. His book, Manuscript, Building Character, The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style, traced the historical integrations of race and style theory in paradigms of architectural organicism, and I think you're going to explain to us what that means, or movements that modeled design on the generative principles of nature. We are so delighted to have him here, and I invite all of you to join me in welcoming Professor Charles Davis.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to come here and speak. I want to just make sure this loads properly, so we'll be watching the same thing. Okay, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time here talking to you about my book, Building Character, The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style. This is a book that I grew out of my dissertation research, really looking at the ways that race and architecture integrated with one another, particularly in the late 19th century. I was really interested in the ways that both race and style discourses would peak at moments of historical tension within a nation state. And so today I want to talk to you about the ways that organic nationalism, or this idea of a nation built up by a racial or ethnic group that is homogeneous in one way or another, is related to the idea of American architecture. And for me, the purpose of this book was to revisit this label of American architecture. Now in Buffalo, New York, we have a lot of pieces of American architecture by people like Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, H.H. Richardson, many of which are described as this kind of inclusive architectural fabric by many of the tours that are given at that time period. But what surprised me when I read the words and the writings of the architects of the time period was that they weren't really interested in every racial or ethnic group in America. They were particularly interested in the ways that European nations and people hailed from European nations would come together and homogenize and synthesize and mongrelize into a new group, something that they called the American race. And how could they create an architecture that would be representative of that work? So this book tries to give us a clue as to how this happened during the time period. particularly through the lens of French and German architectural theory. We could also have included British architectural theories on race and nation, the transatlantic dissemination of those ideas to the United States, and then its development through material forms itself. So if you pick up the book, I try to use two fonts to demonstrate my thesis. I always try to go back to the original writings of the architects and the people whom they read during that time period, and then try and use buildings as a case study for understanding how their thoughts materialized into different building forms. And one of the things that I was able to discover through the reading is that this idea of character was a really useful lens through which to understand how race and style came together in the 19th century. Particularly as Vitruvian theory is being transformed in the late 19th century through the lens of modern scientific investigation. And so the idea of the Vitruvian body, as you might remember or recall, is being changed through scientific discourses on character, physiognomy, and typology in order to make it an empirical source of investigation, not one that was sort of guaranteed by the divine model that subtended the Vitruvian man, but one that could relate to specific areas and specific contexts. And so there was this belief that one could turn architecture into a science through which you could literally relate the building form to the populations that they served, that architectural characters could be made to mirror racial characters. And the science on the architectural side was really historicism and the understanding of how buildings seemed to evolve from the so-called primitive and vernacular all the way up into the proto-modern and the modern of the 19th century. And so, at least in this discourse, when I'm looking at the chapters on American architecture, we should think of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson. We should think of people like Walt Whitman, who are sort of thinking through the lens of American transcendentalism, returning back to nature, thinking of the ways that individual character and self-improvement can be fostered by contact with nature, the study of nature, the exposure to nature. And people like Louis Sullivan, who was inspired by these folks to translate those ideas into architectural form. So on the left here, you can see an opening sort of slide for Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on character. One of his most influential books was on English character and the transmission of English character from across the ocean in the Atlantic to the United States. So he believed that Anglo-American character was the most virile form of English character, and that it was evolving anew in the American landscape. And we see Louis Sullivan on the right, both after reading folks like Emerson and Whitman, but also by visiting the École des Beaux-Arts and learning about character depictions like caricature and other forms of representation, starts to sketch typological depictions of character. At the very top, on the right side, you can see him depicting what is essentially a country cottage, and this idea of the simplicity and the modern pragmatism of the country cottage as the ultimate translation, pragmatic translation of the raw materials of the land into a building form, above a series of what he was starting to explore are the character types that start to emerge in small villages and towns themselves. And so in a very funny way, you could think of the caricatures of this time period of the busybody, right, or the businessman, or the types of people that you would see that would start to emerge within this kind of space. He's thinking of the ways that character can be a universal principle of form, represented in people, represented in nature, and also represented in architecture. And so for me, in the book, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm really looking at this through the lens of architectural organicism. This idea of organicism is a metaphor that helps us to understand how nature and the rules of generation in nature provides a basis for architectural design. So in the 19th century, I want you to think of this as a continuation of Vitruvian theory, and the idea that Vitruvius and the way that he modeled the classicism and neoclassicism of the ancient world, showing itself through the acanthus leaves and the different forms of foliage that made up each of the individual column orders. Now we're in the 19th century, and people like Sullivan and Richardson and others are trying to translate these old ideas into new ideas based on scientific notions of nature. And so I'm really interested in the ways that organic metaphors for architectural design allow for architects to read the notion of character that's being put forward in scientific race theory alongside the evolving notion of character that's emerging within architectural discourses, and the types of projections that start to happen between these two discourses themselves. Now, it's always good to use examples to show what this means in the time period. So here are a few parallel studies of type categories in the sciences. All the way on the left side, we can think of Linnaeus's physical notion of typology through plants, literally looking at the physical appearances of plants and grouping them based on similarities. As we move into the turn of the century, we get people like, after Linnaeus, we get people like Blumenbach and working with Immanuel Kant, thinking about the ways that biology, and particularly the formation of human typologies, or what they would call races, start to emerge themselves. And so in the middle, we have an ethnology diagram, which is a comparison of the ethnographic traits of different groups of nations around the world comparatively. And I want you to look at this diagram for a little bit, because what I find interesting are the forms of visual evidence that was used to substantiate typological categories. We not only get skin color, like we tend to think of it today, but there's also the form of dress. There would also be the culinary practices, the grammar practices of each group. But you can also see hints of architecture in some of these spaces. Some of them are vernacular architectural typologies. Others look like modernist European architectural typologies. And so within this kind of comparative notion of human difference, human variation, there were theories of evolution that sometimes resulted in hierarchies, from those that seemed to be stuck in primitive modes of progress, and those that seemed to be much more inclined to produce modernist or progressive or advanced types of architectures. And so for me, this idea of a progressive form of cultural evolution starts to show visually. And architecture, material culture, becomes a primary form of evidence here. The last image was drawn by the French architectural theorist Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. And he was one of the first people to combine the representation of ethnography, particularly through the visual representation of racial groups, with the visual representation of building typologies themselves, literally showing how racial characters and building characters evolved parallel over time. So in this image, he's showing us the primitive hut of the so-called Dacius races, or the Asian or yellow races of mankind, starting with the rudimentary use of wood and sticks within nature, and then describing how their growth into agrarian societies allowed them to push that onto certain civilizations. And what was interesting is that there's a kind of underlying influence of Aryan migration theory that allows for him to look at the ways that Aryan races, though not masters of architecture proper, but seemingly masters of conquest and governance, are able to come from the tips of the Caucasus Mountains down into the plains below and conquer different groups of mankind. And through synthesis, cultural synthesis, almost like sexual reproduction in nature would produce racial half-breeds and racial mutations, he shows visually how architectural buildings would start to mutate and synthesize themselves. We also get diagrams like this one, which is a regional diagram through the idea of polygenesis, or the notion that maybe different races are representative of different species of man. And there's a kind of geographical specificity here. So underneath the racial representation of different groups by color, skin color, we see a series of animals that would be found within each context. So in a way, there's a theorization that nature is producing these differences somehow underneath things. And in the 19th century language of scientific precision, not only are we given the visualization of the physical appearance of man, but we're given the structure of man underneath, the skull types. And so this idea of the racial profile was supposed to show us geometrically how nature divides and variates mankind itself. And through this was the expectation that in architecture we would see similar things. Different people in different geographies with different raw materials would produce difference naturally on their own. Now, I argue that when architectural designers updated the human body metaphors from Vitruvian architecture theory in the 19th century, they're getting rid of the old divine models that were guaranteed by God or whomever it was that was managing the clockwork of the universe, to actually using science to understand empirically how these things generated, on their own. There's a natural replacement of the old human body metaphors with new scientific categories. And race becomes one of the privileged categories by which we understand difference. And what was interesting about race in this time period is that it was both scientific in terms of understanding how nature produces difference, but it was also cultural. And this is why that ethnography diagram is really important, because both the human body and material culture were used as evidence for understanding this. And so, in a way, the way that Viollet-le-Duc and Gottfried Semper and other 19th century architectural theorists wrote about this, they understood nature as stylizing the different elements of the natural world. So the different form of plants, the different form of people, there was a kind of underlying principle that gave them visual form, sometimes through literal functionality, sometimes through geographical specificity. And if architects could understand how nature was stylizing the organic elements of the world, maybe they could learn to stylize architecture to fit specific contexts. So again, just visually, we're moving from a divine system of the human body, a divine system of nature set in proportion by a higher power, to understanding how one can figure out what the generative principles of nature are, and then use that same rationality to produce order within architecture. Just sort of a note on this image on the right. We have here an image by Claude Perrault, who was a doctor, a physician. He was included as an academician at the École des Beaux-Arts to help them theorize the fundamental orders of architecture, both for the French crown, but also for general architectural theory. And he's using the rules of proportion not to imitate what was found in the ancient world, but to generate a natural progression from the lowest order to the highest order based on ideals of proportion geometrically. And he calls this, if you look at the title, we can see that term, espèces de colonne, so the 5 species of column according to the methods of the ancients. So this idea, this language from science is already creeping into architectural discourse by the late 1600s. And so, in my mind, these conceptual parallels resulted in a set of design strategies that abstracted the principles of nature in ways that personified the behavior of buildings. We start to see architects understand the process of design as almost a simulated process of natural selection, primarily using the typologies that were given to us through history being combined and brought together and synthesized to produce new solutions. Here's a set of diagrams that was given to one of the polytechnic schools in France that paralleled the École des Beaux-Arts. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination. You just squint your eyes and think about some of those circular forms literally morphing into the other circular forms, almost like an amoeba adjusting to an environment based on external stimuli. So there's this notion that architectural design problems will naturally adjust to their environment, extending or receding based on the requirements of the program. In addition, we get a sense of buildings across time being treated like found objects in nature. And I want you to imagine that instead of looking here at buildings that are drawn at the same scale, plan, section, elevation, we're an entomologist, and we've gone and found insects and pinned them up on the wall to compare them one to the other, so we can understand physically what makes them similar and what makes them different. This methodology from the sciences, particularly comparative analysis, starts to creep into architectural discourse. So for me, the best analytical lens for our contemporary audience, because we tend to think about today race through the notions of skin color, through the notions of the human body. And so with Vitruvianism waning and the human body metaphors of that notion waning, I argue that there are implicit human body metaphors present in the new scientific discourses that come to replace Vitruvianism in the 19th century. Now, they aren't discussed in the exact same terms, but there are terms related to bodily function, bodily form. Things like corporeality, things like character, things like physiognomy. And this notion of comparing buildings as bodies or treating them as bodies. I'm sure you must have heard the expression, the bones of the building are covered by the skin of the building. This isn't accidental. This is a kind of continuity of Vitruvianism into the present moment. And so I'm looking for the racialization of human body metaphors within this discourse as time progresses. So if we look at the book, I've broken it into two parts. Part one takes us back to Western Europe. We look at France and Germany and the invention of structural rationalism in France and tectonic theory in Germany, primarily through this lens of Alpine architectures as being the kind of vernacular or prototypical architectures of the past. And I'm really interested in the ways that Aryan migration theory provides a scientific model for tracing the origins of European nationalism back to a kind of primitive root. And so this is really evident in the vernacular architectural typologies that start to be documented and evidenced in the French, Swiss, and Bavarian Alps, or think of the Alpine range, both as a kind of the Alps are important because both they emerge as a site for leisure, where people go and they start to ski and vacation at this time period, but they're also a site of scientific discovery. The idea of cartography and how to map the tectonic plates of the earth, not only in the current geometry of the mountains themselves, but thinking back to what they might have been in ancient times and using those scientific principles to imagine other forms of evolution in time. So chapter one takes us through the thinking of the French architect Eugène-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc and the vernacular revival of Aryan character. He thinks of himself as a modern-day Aryan man using science to revive the essence of historical vernacular typologies, this time in concrete and modernist materials, so from wood to masonry, as a way of thinking of the ways that Aryan man actually migrated across the French-Swiss border where he was practicing at that time period. In chapter 2 looks at the work of Gottfried Semper, who was a Dresden architect. He's practicing right before the time period of German unification. And so his exploration of German ethnography actually has a political purpose. It has him thinking about what prototypical roots of German architecture, given the differences in language and religion between the North and the South and the multiplicity of cultural groups within Germany, one of the last nations to unify and modernize in Europe. He's wondering if ethnography would give him a prototypical root that is common to all the cultural difference that was currently in Germany, and that if he could find this ethnographically, if he could use architecture to literally design oneself out of the problem of German unification. Can we create a modern architecture that dates back to the common root that goes beyond all of our differences to allow for us to come together. And so one of the things that he discovered, along with Leo von Klenze and some other German theorists at the time period, is a kind of what they believed was a kind of pure primitive architecture in the mountain ranges just outside of the modern German cities. And so the Alps becomes a place, the birthplace, rather, of certain forms of German character. Part 2 then looks at the transmission of these ideas from Western Europe into the United States, into what I identify here as the whiteness of American architecture. And particularly, it's important to remember that, at least in the ways that I'm writing about it, I'm thinking of the United States as a settler colony. So not just, a place of the land of the free and the home of the brave and the birthplace of democracy, the way that the United States tends to depict itself, but also to take into consideration the fact that it was European settlers who came to the US, displaced Native Americans from their land, and also created a discourse or a mythology about America that required the assimilation of subsequent waves of immigrants. And so within this model, whiteness is starting to be defined in the 19th century. The boundaries of whiteness in the United States, which national groups from Western Europe are the most influential in this Anglo-American notion of American character, and how architecture starts to then legitimize this vision of America. This is really where the lens of organic nationalism starts to come into play. Architecture starts to visualize what it means to be a part of this kind of nation. And I'm really interested in the ways that national character here are defined through a lens that is exclusively white. Now, when I was doing my dissertation, I had the expectation that when I read the original theories of Western Europeans and Americans in the 19th century, I would find lots of references to blackness or Africans. But in reality, most people didn't mention them because there was this assumption that they didn't have a history. They were still primitive. Instead, the leading edge of scientific investigation was to understand what new forms of whiteness were emerging. And the American race was this weird experiment where different nations got together and mongrelized and created a new kind of race, a new kind of culture. So actually whiteness was the way that they started to understand and identify themselves. And if we understand American architecture through that lens, we can see how it is that American architects like Louis Sullivan and Richardson and others are creating a formal solution to this problem of what is whiteness in a space like the United States. So chapter 3, I really look at the ways that Louis Sullivan, who was an Irish American, second generation, his father's an immigrant from Ireland, tries to distinguish himself from his father's generation as someone who is capable of creating a unique American architecture by virtue of his synthetic identity. And I look at the ways that he takes theories of physiognomy, both in science and literature, and translates them into physiognomic notions of architectural character in the United States. And then chapter 4 looks at the afterlives of this notion of organic nationalism, architectural organicism, in what we commonly understand to be the international style. So in the common parlance, this is an architecture that is now no longer national, it's no longer identified by style. It seems to be abstract enough that it can become international. It can settle in just about any context around the world. But what I found interesting was that in every context, you have modern architectural designers who are constantly trying to localize this international style. And so I look at the work of William Lescaz, who is an immigrant to the US, a European immigrant, and he Americanizes the international style, particularly in the form of public housing, because this is a context where Europeans are still coming into the nation, learning to become Americans, and the context itself helps to train them to become good citizens of the body politic. Now I'm going to take you through chapter 3 just to give you a sense of what forms of evidence and what kind of claims I make with the work, and then hopefully there'll be enough there to give you a sense of the method that I tend to use throughout the book, and then I'd like to entertain questions about some of the other themes involved in it itself. This chapter really looks at the architectural form of a synagogue designed by Louis Sullivan for the south side of Chicago, a Reform Jewish congregation there. And you see that the final design on the left, Kehilath Anshe Ma'ariv Synagogue in Chicago, 1890 to 1891. I like Sullivan as a case study because for me he becomes representative of the ways that American architects write themselves into both the long history of European arts and letters, but also invents a new tradition of American arts and letters. And Sullivan particularly was very nervous about his Irishness because there was a lot of prejudice against Irish immigrants in the United States. And this has to do with the fact that in Europe, in terms of the hierarchy of nations, those who are coming from Ireland are coming at the lower end of the hierarchy scale. And so to assimilate within American culture, there are lots of things that are happening socially and also philosophically in terms of how they understand their national traditions in the US. And so I argue that Sullivan tries to prove his Americanness by mastering the visual language of architecture. Showing himself to be a master of art and material form demonstrates that he is much more capable than the Irish immigrants who came before him. And within his own discourse, when you read his works, particularly his autobiography, where he summarizes his life and the life of architecture as an idea within his own discourse, you get a really strong sense of the skepticism he has towards first-generation immigrants from European nations, regardless of where they're coming from. He believes that they're still so tied to the old world that they can't really adapt in the new world, as well as a skepticism towards people of color, whether it's Latinx, Asian American, or African American groups. These are groups that he believes, regardless of what their place is in the new America, they are not destined to lead the nation in producing this new form of modernism. And so when you read his work, in a way that, all sort of anxious men write themselves as geniuses in their own work, right? This is autobiography. And he's showing that, by being exposed to nature and being able to master the principles of nature, he was able to create a new American form itself. And I look at this building as an example where that theory starts to break down. This idea of assimilating into a particular notion of American body politic starts to pull itself apart based on the historical tensions of Jewish Americans as a white ethnic group in the US that both seeks to assimilate within this notion of Anglo-American character, but while retaining certain essential qualities of their own difference within this context. And so by wanting to express their difference, they pull against Sullivan's assimilative model of what it means to be American in architectural parlance. We can see this a little bit in the treatment of the building's interior. So when Sullivan is designing a building, and he uses the term organic, there's a sense that all of the pieces naturally flow into one another. There's a kind of visual singularity to the work. And his use of ornament usually ties these separate elements together visually and formally in the design. So if we look on the left side, here's an interior of that synagogue itself. You can notice sort of the foliated ornamentation that's in the banding just above the stage. You can see the chandeliers that have a kind of foliated ornament to them as well. And the ways that this banding not only creates a kind of baseline that captures the eye, but in the semicircular forms rather, above and below that line, it also brings us into different elements in the plan. Now what's interesting about this is that grill in that top semicircle, that actually is hiding an organ that's placed within the body of the building. So when the organ starts to play and the choir starts to play, and you can see that the alcoves at the very bottom, they're square-like on either side of the auditorium stage. It's almost as if the building itself is singing to you. It's not the people, it's not the instruments, but the building opens itself up and like an element of nature, sort of like the birds sing or the things that happen within nature itself. And when we look at the changes that were made to this space, on the right side is an image years later when an African-American Baptist congregation has taken over this space. All of those elements that were integrated into one another are now pulled apart because of the spatial praxes that are introduced by a Black Baptist congregation. So that grill above that used to hide the choir, the organ, that organ you can now see on the top right tier of upper seating at the very end of the stage. And particularly those two square alcoves that hid the choir previously, now they have spilled out into the congregation itself. And these changes musically are really the result of the emergence of the gospel blues in the south side of Chicago. Part of a result of the Great Migration of African Americans moving from the South to the North, and the tension between the upper middle class blacks who were able to buy this congregation, and the working class blacks who were coming from the South with so-called old-time religion that much more easily translated into the blues that you heard on the radio, wanting for these religious practices to reflect their way of worship. And so what we see is a pressure for the clergymen who previously could stand apart from the congregation, now moving closer toward the congregation. If you were in this congregation space, you would hear a lot of call and response, people sort of getting the Holy Spirit and speaking back to those on the stage, particularly during musical events and venues. You would hear certain words from the choir being sung, and then you'd hear it again in the audience. And this call and response, this need to connect these spaces, pulls some of the elements out of the frame that Sullivan has created into the congregation itself to allow for them to connect. In addition to that, we see, and there's a really great article written by Kimberly Pinder, looking at the representation of biblical scenes where Jesus and his 12 apostles are represented as people of color, of mixed racial heritage. We see people from very light-skinned black to very dark-skinned black being depicted through the biblical scenes. And so both in terms of visual representation and spatial practice, we see both Jewish Americans and African Americans trying to decide how they want to be American. And sometimes these decisions counter what the architect intended originally for this piece. Now, if we go back to Sullivan's writings and the way that he thinks about things, again, we can go back to Ralph Waldo Emerson's notion of character, and particularly Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. So Sullivan, I don't know how to say this charitably, other than he was a really bad poet. He decided that he was going to become the architectural parallel of Whitman. He was going to create in architecture the poetry that Whitman created on the page. And he wrote to Whitman and tried to explain this to him. And what's interesting is that in doing so, I find that he emulates their notion of character and the tacit assumptions of the period. So if we go to Ralph Waldo Emerson's book, English Traits, we get this notion that Anglo-American character is really the result of British character, or Anglo-Saxonism, crossing the Atlantic, literally marching westward into the United States, and evolving as it does so. And so he thinks of Anglo-Americanism as the latest form of Anglo-Saxon character. And Walt Whitman, who has certain poetic depictions of peace between whites and blacks, really finds a skeptical attitude towards blacks in everyday life. And this is evidenced through an op-ed in the Brooklyn Daily Times from 1858, where he talks about who really is destined to run America. He says, who believes that the whites and blacks can ever amalgamate in America, or who wishes it to happen? Nature has set an impassable seal against it. Besides, it's not America for the whites, and is it not better so? As long as the blacks remain here, how can they become anything like an independent and heroic race? There is no chance for it, right? So he's using this term amalgamate, and this isn't accidental. He's thinking about the ways that literally racial groups amalgamate into each other. and culturally how they synthesize. And he believes that there's too much of a difference between whites and blacks, or whites and non-whites generally, for this to happen. And so if we want a heroic race that is able to create a new form of art, then we need to concentrate on the white groups that can do so. And so, again, I'm returning now here to these sketches of Sullivan, where he's exploring what this means in terms of the typologies that we see in social groups and social settings, as well as alongside architectural elements. And he writes himself that physiognomy as a principle of nature can be seen in both organic and inorganic elements, in the shape of a mountain to the elements of architecture. Here he writes in Kindergarten Chats, "From the character of a peer, may we not discern the character of a race? And from the slowly changing character of a developed peer, may we not discern the temperamental changes taking place in a race, its growth, its fulfillment, its decay?" An evolutionary notion of character showing itself in race and architecture. In the autobiography of an idea, he says, "It seems strange at first glance that these highly virile and sensitive powers should be embodied in one so unlovely a person. His medium size, his two sloping shoulders, his excessively Irish face, his small repulsive eyes, the eyes of a pig, of nondescript color and no flash, sunk into his head under rough brows." This is one of the first of many literal physiognomic depictions of people. He's literally racially profiling people. Who do we think he's talking about here? He's talking about his own father. This is how he sees his father through this physiognomic lens. And he's depicting him in the very stereotypical ways that Americans depicted Irish immigrants to distinguish themselves from that particular group. He's literally taking on the racism of Anglo-Americans to distinguish himself from his own father, from the Irish immigrants that he was raised with. And by contrast, he loves the physiognomic depiction of his mother. Here's a passage from the autobiography. "As to the mother, Louis Sullivan, she seemed French, but was not wholly so. She had the typical eyelids, expressive hazel eyes, an oval face, features mobile. She was of medium stature, trimly built, highly emotional, and given to ecstasies of speech." And when we look at Sullivan's library, there are a couple of books that he published by Alfred E. Willis that were manuals of physiognomy. And the very language that he used to describe his mother comes from these physiognomic journals. The monogamic eye that seems to be arrested with cupidity, not stupidity, cupidity, but also with curiosity. And so he believes that he got this curiosity, this wonder about nature from his mother, while distancing himself from the elements of his father. He even describes his business partner, Denkmar Adler, by using the traditional and stereotypical notions of Jewishness, which we again can trace back to these physiognomic journals. And so I argue that physiognomy isn't just a kind of general trait of the language of the time period, but it represents a formal principle of development. And Sullivan translates this from the sciences into architecture in his design for Kahilath Anshe Ma'ariv Synagogue. Here's the first design that he wanted to complete for that synagogue. Notice its appearance. It has a very synthetic feel. There isn't a difference between the lower level and the top level that we see in the final design. In addition, the ecclesiastical character of that building is missing. Now what we have is something that looks more like an armory or some kind of civic structure, a civic building. What Sullivan really liked about the Reformed Jewish congregation was that they were willing to be much more secular than other religions. And in his mind, he believed that America would develop by eliminating the so-called feudal elements of the old world, its religiosity, for something that would allow for a more common and democratic way of being. So the church would really become nothing more than a meeting hall where people would come together and use rationalism and secular ideas to congregate with one another. He's combining elements of Jewish history, particularly in time periods when there's a lot of resistance against Jewish presence. There's a removal of the Saracenic and Orientalized elements of the design, and they look much more pragmatic. And this follows along with Richardson's work in the Richardsonian Romanesque that look much more rationalized and smoothed out in terms of its features. If we look at the plan, there's an interesting division between what happens on the ground floor, which is where a lot of the after-school programs, the book clubs, the social organizations happened. And then the church itself was elevated above the profane to create the sacred level where things would occur. And so he follows this kind of pragmatic and programmatic division. And then, again, we see his original design for that interior, which matches some of the renovations that he was doing with Denkmar Adler to other Reformed Jewish congregations of the time period. Now, what I think is interesting is why we get the building we got versus the one that he wanted. So if he had a synthetic vision of how religiosity would become secularized, how do we read this particular design? What I see is a remnant of that original vision on the ground level, particularly as it relates to the social programs that reach out into the polis itself and goes back into the city. But then the part that's a clear story, which is the visual representation of the rising up of the sacred on the inside. Now what we have are elements that are much more referential of Jewish religious symbology. Joseph Siri, who's an architectural theorist who looks at both Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan's works, looks at the windows and in that upper clear story and notices their similarity to the tablets that Moses brought down from the mount as he got the word of God to come down. And then overall, we can look at the massing and the decoration on this part of the building, which has a very similar iconography to the Ark of the Covenant itself. And one of the critiques that some of the congregants within the Reformed congregation that Sullivan was serving, as well as other buildings, and there are newspaper articles and criticisms by Montgomery Schuyler and others on this, they lamented the fact that Sullivan's architecture seemed so secular that it didn't seem to properly represent the ecclesiastical character of the space. Here we see a remnant of the ecclesiastical character now making its way out. And for me, this represents not a breakdown of Sullivan's theory, not a poor representation of Sullivan's theory, but actually a visual representation of the hyphenated American. The fact that Americans, white Americans during this time period, are both striving to assimilate within the Anglo-American notion of character, but also many of them try to retain some of the character of who they are in this space. And this is something that Sullivan's architecture wouldn't normally produce. But because he's working with a congregation that is resistant to some of his architectural ideas, we get the architecture that we see here. And so for me, I read this very differently from other architectural critics and theorists. This isn't a failing of Sullivan. This is an expansion of his idea of American architecture. He's forced to accommodate something that he doesn't know how to think about in his own terms. I think that the same thing starts to happen when a Black Baptist congregation takes over this space. What's interesting is that there are theorizations of what building character means in Black America. We can think of the words of Booker T. Washington from his HBCU in the South. And before this building became a Black Baptist congregation, there were a group of philanthropists that got together that wanted to turn it into a normal school, very much like what Booker T. Washington ran in the South, because of its monumental character, because it fit the notion of restrained character that Washington believed Black architecture should represent in the 19th century. And then I did mention and walk you through the kind of elements that changed and shifted, that pulled away from the synthetic frame of the building. Here's an example on the right of some of the representations that show people of color through various hues around Jesus himself. literally showing black subjects trying to write themselves into the biblical tradition and into the Christian tradition that America was basing itself on. And I really like this image because over the course of time, as a congregation has to decide where it needs to spend its money and how it would maintain the building, that section at the top that I read earlier as related to visual representations of Jewishness starts to abate and disappear. And it starts to become much more anonymous in the way that it is represented in the space of the building. Now, tragically, around 2006, there was a fire during one of the renovations of the building. The entire interior was gutted, and the church immediately started fundraising to figure out how they could rebuild this church. In working with preservationists, however, they came up with a dilemma. What state of the building should they restore it to? Should it be restored to the original design by Denkmar and Adler? Or should it be restored to the state that it was in when gospel music first emerged within the building? They decided to go with the latter. And in the first illustrations of this building, again, we see the clear story level being left in abeyance, abstracted, not visualized with the kind of character that would pin it down to one group or another. For me, this is a kind of a visualization of the ways that Louis Sullivan's notion of American architecture is evolving over time. It's actually the long history of this building that ultimately makes it a piece of American architecture, not the piece that he designed originally in the 1890s. And it is only with this notion of how can we write African Americans into this work that allows it to be fully American. I should note this, that if you think about and you look at the long history of the South Side of Chicago, what's interesting is that it starts off as a white ethnic enclave, and slowly, through the hardening of racial segregation, becomes a black enclave. And so it's African Americans who have to become the stewards of Sullivan's work, even though they were written out of being American in his original theories. And so I find this to be highly ironic, particularly because the ways that architectural historians are trained to think about what is significant about one's architecture. It's always, what are the words and thinking of the architect? What did he put on the plan? But it isn't until his work is forced to be stewarded by the one group that he said could not be fully American that it actually becomes fully American. And for me, this is an argument for rethinking how it is that we understand architecture. Architecture, capital A, is not what the architect intends. It is what the architect intends in conversation with what people make of that space. And we should give them space within our historiography to be authors of this work. So I thank you for your patience and time. Hopefully that was clear, and I'd love to entertain any questions that you have on this work. Maybe. Okay. Please.
I have a complicated question.
Okay.
One, most of the references we've looked at are during Reconstruction, which in itself was a turbulent time as it relates to race relations in the United States. Two, sort of this birthplace of American architecture, as we now call it, happens during that same time where we were seeing a lot of, I would call it cultural transformations in the United States with regards to the emergence of the bourgeoisie or the middle class in America, what we now call the Gilded Age. And we saw groups of people amassing more cash and capital than those same demographic groups had previously. So what we have are a lot of Irish, Italian, first and second generation immigrants moving into the middle class. Obviously, we had Jewish population. We saw that population rising and sort of its holding culture in terms of like capital and architecture as a patron situation. So no matter what the architect designs, your client always has to agree to it. How much of this already, that conversation in 1870?
So that's a very good question. One of the things that I try to foreground in the book is that the notion of being what it means to be American is contested, and that architects like Sullivan are presenting a kind of unified vision as a particular response. And the folks who follow him, like Frank Lloyd Wright and others, and he's following Richardson, that's one particular tradition of what this means, right? There's also architectural eclecticism, and so P.B. White and others are thinking of ways of reimagining European architectural styles within this new context and reassociating what they mean. There's an excellent article written by Joanna Merwood, two actually. One that tells us how some of this revisionist eclecticism becomes representative of things like abolitionism and other forms of American philosophies, not just sort of this notion of organic nationalism that I'm talking about here, the kind of exclusively white one. And then what we have to remember is that even during this time period, there's a mythology that continues to evolve and that eventually becomes hegemonic, which is this notion of manifest destiny, and the idea that the core of American culture is within the heartland of America, within the Midwest. This idea of European settler culture around pilgrims and then later ranches and this kind of rudimentary architectures, they're read in a proto-modernist way to show how they become these other sources. So at the same time that the visions like Sullivan are being presented, there are competing visions as well. And I think what we haven't documented very well are both the competing forms of whiteness that are occurring simultaneously, as well as the forms of blackness that are emerging during periods like Reconstruction, how black patrons and clients, when they step into these new roles, just like any post-colonial moment, right? They get to re-signify what that means for their spaces. And this is up and down because right after Reconstruction, there's a period of redemption, there's the introduction of Jim Crow laws, there are different expositions that are held within the US, and there are Negro buildings within them that also have contentious ways of reading blackness within the landscape. And so all this is to say that I've presented to you just one strain of this, and there are probably 15 others that are parallel. And that it's hard for us to understand them because visually they look the same. But the fusion of the elements and how one argues through the lens of historicism, what constitutes them as American is various. And so, at least for me, this is what makes the 19th century so fascinating, because like from today's modernist or proto-modernist lens, these are just old buildings, they're just a combination of elements, who cares what they mean, like they're not modern, right? We just strip them away and make them anonymous, and then they become modern. But in the 19th century, they speak volumes, right? Grafton, I can't remember his first name, has written a book on Egyptomania in the United States, and the ways that it both represents a kind of primacy of the United States, that they're trying to parallel the primacy of Egypt historically. So America becomes a new form of history, a new modern figure that leaves the Western Europeans in the dust, as well as the ways that the division of white and black races along the Nile parallels the division of white and black races along the Mississippi, and the parallels that happen there. So within, I think like not 2 blocks from here, there's an Egyptomania facade, along the street. That's a remnant of what that might have meant within a kind of emerging metropolis like Philadelphia. So across from the colonialism that tends to be looked at as the origin, we have experiments on all these other ways of understanding the primacy of the United States. And so for me, what becomes interesting are the associations of both the architects and the users and how that starts to evolve over time. And probably by like the 1920s and 30s, that game is over. No one's sort of doing that anymore. But instead what happens, I argue in the book, is that the particularities we would see in individual styles on the outside are now internalized. The spatial protocols of antique forms of architecture, they're revived at the level of the plan and the composition that allows for people to say, I've revived, the Greek way of living, or the Aryan way of living, or the African way of living. And that it's not always in the building itself, maybe the frame, the structural frame of some elements, and maybe the plan, but it's a harder way of identifying race. And for me, this parallels the way that we as a country learn to stop talking about race, but we still learn to be racialized subjects. So we never have given that practice up. We just sort of, learn not to talk about it because it becomes less fashionable and less possible for us to become a kind of plural metropolis in that sense. So that's like a non-answer, but it's an answer. In that, like, there are many things that are happening here, and I have to present like 5 or 6 different case studies to really show you how the different groups are thinking through the problem of what it means to be white in America or to be a different group. I do think one of the interesting things there is that it might be possible in the 19th century to think of American, not Anglo-American or white American, as a kind of super category that people borrow and put certain meanings in, particularly those who are not white. So when we look at the ways that African Americans and Jewish Americans think of themselves as American, not just at home, but especially when they travel abroad, right? So we get to the New Negro movement, and we see folks moving across continents, and most people don't think of them as African Americans, they think of them as Americans. And so they have to think about what that means within that context. That also kind of complicates the reading there. That's a great question. It makes me think of like, what 7 things I could show you this. If I could like tie you to your seats and make you watch.
How do the change in materials and techniques and just laying the architect on one thing play a part in the 19th century changes, evolves, so the architect has to change, or he changes because, there's a new form of cement or a new form of something else.
Mm-hmm. So like your question reminds me of architectural histories that try to explain the progression of form as a result of the changes in technology. So that when a new form of like Portland cement comes along, or a new form of bonding, or a new technique for creating concrete forms emerges, that oftentimes we're looking for a kind of formal shift in the architecture, or a shift in the way that the architect thinks of these buildings and structures. I think that sometimes that happens, but I don't know that it happens as naturally as we tend to think of it. So when I look at the work of Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and William Lescaz here in the book, they're each arguing against a kind of progressive model of history that only looks at technology as the engine by which things change. And they're trying to figure out culturally, what do these elements mean? And so in a way, I feel like, like if you were to read the 1932 catalog to the International Style Show, it would literally be that way. It would say that, there were styles that naturally emerged through vernacular uses. There's kind of eclecticism that happened when nations were trying to figure out who they were. And now we're at this time period where we have concrete, and we have steel, and we no longer need the things that made us nationalist architectures in the past. But what I see are architects like William Lescaz, architects like Le Corbusier, architects like others, trying to localize these things, because to actually exist in an international context is a little bit too abstract and too freed from how people are living their lives. And so in one way, I feel like what I find interesting is not that discourse, but the ways that architects are resisting that discourse. Like the ways that Sullivan wants his architecture to be of Chicago, of the Midwest, and not of the East Coast, and not like, look at the stuff on the West Coast. It's even weirder and crazier and more eclectic than that stuff. But then there's another layer. Mabel Wilson has written a really good chapter in Race and Modern Architecture, so it's Peter Benoche in that volume, that talk about the ways that certain forms of labor are rendered invisible. So the kinds of ways that the architect who's making the drawing, he's the geometer, right? He's the intellectual who's trying to understand engineering processes and trying to create drawings that reflect this. There's also the invisibilization of hand labor. People who actually were stereometers. They cut the stone, they put it in place. They were skilled people, primarily because they were non-white. And so you have buildings like the Capitol building that were put together by black hands, many of whom were skilled laborers, but are identified as unskilled, and therefore their contributions to that building are made invisible. But we have to go back and say, well, how is it that in actuality, if we think of their work as skilled in a different way than what the architect does, but just as crucial, when you do that, and Peter Benoche does this really in a genius way, we actually get buildings like the Capitol building and the White House, where visually, rhetorically, in terms of their ornament, they represent freedom and democracy and equality. But in their material conditions, how they were put together, they could not be done without racial capitalism, without slave labor and leasing slave labor. And so they actually embody the paradox of what it means to be an American. And we only get the full story when we do what you say, like, how did it get put together? Who did these things? What kinds of techniques did they bring from the South and making plantations in the South to the North that were foreign to the kind of work practices that were there in those places that now makes it American, not in a rhetorical, abstract sense, but in a real sense. And for me, it's really useful to hold those things in tension, because you get folks like the architect of the Capitol building, who really wanted to figure out how can we do away with the sin of slavery. Like, he actually experimented not just in architecture, but he tried to create a language that was not just standard English or American English, but was an English that we could all use. He tried to bring freed slaves from the US to new territories to let them govern themselves. And at every path, he failed, because structurally our country was so predicated on racial capitalism that he couldn't free himself from it. So all he could do was really visualize this paradox and hope that at some point in the future we would resolve this problem. But to me, that's a much more beautiful image of what the Capitol building is and what the White House is. It's much more truthful to say, we needed slave labor to make this representation of freedom that isn't quite free. And that we're still struggling with this as a nation because structurally we were given conditions that make it very difficult to make a free democracy. And I feel like if we had the courage to teach that history, then we'd actually get more Americans to experiment with how to move beyond it, as opposed to creating whitewashed mythologies of, well, we just have to look at the unifying rhetoric of the Constitution and everything else, and then we'll be fine. I think that the architects who used that language knew who they were speaking to. It was a very narrow group of Americans, but they wanted that franchise to be expanded. And, if we put ourselves in their mindset, I think it's a much healthier way of understanding American arts and letters and American architecture. But I think it's a really great question. And, for me anyway, I tend to shy away from those questions as a kind of initial reaction, just because so many people have used it to structure things. So it's not that it isn't important, but I think that it tends to be used to over-explain certain elements. Okay. If there is one more question. Yes, please. So yes, and it's really interesting to see that play out. So I'm trying to think of his full name. I know his first name was Junius the clergyman who was in charge of the congregation, he was a part of a storied middle-class black family. Like, he paralleled some of the folks who brought the first black banks to Chicago. And he went to seminary, and he learned how to basically run a congregation the way that a white congregation would run it. And so there are journal entries of folks who are coming from the Great Migration, and they hear it's a black church, they hear it's doing well, they go there, and they hear people start singing, they're like, where am I? Who are these people? Because they do not sing like us, they do not practice like us. And so the way that there was a kind of a class element that was really at work there. There was a kind of respectability politics on how you should present yourself, how you should dress, how you should speak. And it led to a real prejudice against blues music when it first came into the congregation. Because those who were running the congregation didn't think of it as a kind of idiom of the black church. They knew that you could hear it on the radio. And so, people were talking about, free sexual politics, and there was a kind of like street culture surrounding that kind of music. And so it was really hard to kind of domesticate that for that interior space. Literally, there's a kind of history of people who were raised within the church, not sort of singing outside first, but raised within the church, learning to become virtuosos in the chorus, and then moving outside. And like people like Aretha Franklin start to, represent this kind of lineage. This is a counter lineage to the folks who made ends meet by making blues music on the outside, going to church and wanting to spiritualize that, and the way that it was recodified within that. And so there is a kind of black respectability politics at work there that shows up in the ways that things are shown, but then also a kind of ultimate victory socially. Like when we get to the point where now the building has to be restored, nobody's thinking about the respectability politics of Junius and the other kind of upper middle class blacks. They're thinking about the birth of the gospel blues, the one that goes out and gets the whole world to love black music. And so the ultimate victory of that even overturns the expectations of the congregation there. So in that sense, I think there absolutely is tension, intra-tension within groups, both within white Americans, and who is white, and how can you prove yourself to be white, but also black Americans, in terms of what does it mean to be respectable? How can we present ourselves as equals to whites in this kind of racialized context? And there's a lot of shaming of low-income poverty and low-income decorum in that sense that I think we still have with us in that sense, and particularly in architecture as a kind of lettered art form. You have to present yourself in a particular way. But for me, I think that's what makes the story interesting, if we can restore that within the history of those works. Thank you all. You've been so patient. I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Charles Davis II. This was just fascinating, and I love these lectures where you have to pay attention because there is depth. It's not just yes, not just. I so appreciate that. And for those of you who want to explore more, we do have in our library both Race and Modern Architecture, which was edited by Irene Chen Charles and Mabel Wilson, and there's some really excellent articles in here, as well as his book Building Character. So invite you, if you're a member, you can check them out, and if you become a member, you can check them out. You can also buy them, but you can check them out in our library. And we're so glad that you came. This is fabulous. If you enjoyed this, we can have a little bit more, we have conversation about this on Saturday afternoon. If you come during our open hours, we're going to have, 2 Saturdays ago, we had a children's book festival, and we had a collage workshop, and we have a whole bunch of stuff left over. So come on Saturday afternoon if you want, and make a collage and talk about architecture and representation and whatever else you want. On Monday afternoon, we have with Carrie Ricky finishing up our French cinema series to see the Umbrellas of Cherbourg and have a conversation about that with Carrie Ricky, who is just a renowned film critic. Those are always fun times. And next Friday, we have our first Friday we're going to look at our ornithology collection. So if you love birds, and another fun opportunity. So we kind of have a little bit of everything. So glad you came tonight. Thank you so much. I think Dr. Davis is here if you wanted to ask him a few questions afterwards. And hope you will all come back again. Have a wonderful evening.